go to Genesis chapter 35. Your homework for next week is to read Genesis chapter 36. And you say, is that even fair to give homework? Yes, it is. You're going to be reading a lot of names. I'm going to be saving you a lot of ear pain, okay? So instead of me reading through 1,000 names for you on a Sunday evening, read through it on Monday morning to wake yourself up. And then when we get to it next week, I'll just say, yes, this is what happened, and we're going to go into 37. Everybody agree on that? We'll make a covenant together, okay? We're not going to be splitting two animals and walk through the midst of them tonight. I don't think that would be safe for us to do, but we will make a covenant together. Everyone is going to raise their right hand and say, I will read Genesis chapter 36. Good. All right, thank you. Only 3 of you did. But anyway, let's go to Genesis chapter 35. And we'll start there. This is interesting. If you thought last week was interesting, this is going to jump into some more interesting. And again, this is one that we really don't get to touch on a lot, and going through Sunday school and hitting in Genesis, usually you're going to highlight some of these things that's going on here, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this. So I've entitled this, Is God Enough? And your Sunday school answer is? Yes, He's enough, okay? But in all practicality, does our life speak as if God is enough? Not the Sunday school answer. That's a Sunday night answer, okay? All right, but in all actuality, listen, this goes for the youngest kid all the way to the oldest individual in here. And I'm not going to guess anybody's ages in here tonight. Some of you are probably proud of it. Yes, I've had 90 winners, and I love it, Is that what we speak by at that point? But listen, this goes all the way from the youngest age, because when you're asking the question, is God enough, then that applies in the midst of salvation. But yet as soon as you get saved, you're still asking that question, because when things start to go awry, when things start to be deleted in our lives, when we start losing things in our lives, then all of a sudden people really struggle with this question. And I'll get to that as far as the application goes here later on. But please stay tuned in here for Genesis chapter 35. Now, if I ask the question, what happened last week, can anybody answer me? Give me a PG rated one. No? I know, you slept since then. So, this is important. Context is always important, okay? Because it makes sense of the beginning of this chapter when you understand what happened in Genesis chapter 34. So we understand that Esau, they're reconciled. Jacob and Esau reconciled. They come to it. You had the cushion effect. You remember that? Remember that point? Where all of a sudden Jacob's got all of these gifts for his brother. And then Jacob wrestles with God overnight, right? And then all of a sudden, here, he touched the hollow of his thigh. Automatically, Jacob has an issue. And then, the interesting dietary law of the Jews is that they would not eat that portion of of an animal after that. I just thought that was interesting. But we go along into the next part where Jacob's actually back into the promised land, but he's going to have some issues with some neighbors. Remember, the only daughter that was mentioned in the lineup was Dinah. Oh, good. We got someone who didn't forget everything in their sleep. And we have this reason why is because we go into Genesis chapter 34. And where was Dinah hanging out? At the arcade? She was hanging out with the ladies of the land, okay? So she was mixing her lot. She was jumping in with some friends of the land. They were becoming acclimated with the culture, which meant that she put herself in a pretty difficult situation. And that did not excuse, by the way, that did not excuse Shechem's response to her putting herself into a difficult situation, okay? All right? So if we want to talk about that later, we can, because that's really not the part that we want to focus on here tonight. But all of a sudden, she gets taken advantage of, and then a couple of brothers get upset. They go in and they kill off all the guys in Shechem. And if you want to go back through the story because you missed it last week, guess what? We have live stream. You can go back and watch it, all right? So otherwise, we can talk about it in person. That's cool. I love talking about the Bible. So that's kind of, what I do. But anyway, along those lines, if you go off and you murder an entire civilization of males and then steal all the females and the children and all their livestock, do you think you're going to have any issues with the other neighbors in the land? And the answer is yes. Why? Because are we next? I was buddies with that guy. He was my neighbor. And even though we might be calling ourselves as a different tribe, I've got an issue with you. But you know what? God always seems to step in. And that's where we find ourselves tonight. But that's what you got to cue in right at the beginning here. If you get to context, all of a sudden Jacob realizes it. Jacob/Israel, we're still in the midst of his name transition because it'll talk about this in Genesis chapter 35. But here it is. We're coming to this point where Jacob's like, hey, sons, you really messed it up for us. Everybody's going to have it out for us. Now everybody's going to be teaming up against us, and this is not going to be good neighborhood relations. So guess where we're at? Genesis chapter 35, and in verse number 1, we're going to find that God instructs. So that's going to be point number 1, and it's only going to be verse number 1, so it's going to be really fast. But as we jump into verse number 1, here it reads, and God said unto Jacob, here's his plan, here's his way to get out of the situation. Arise, go up to Bethel. Do you remember where Bethel was? What happened to Bethel? I know, I'm being so informal tonight, but what happened to Bethel? He went to sleep on a rock, and then there was a ladder going from the earth to heaven, and angels descending and ascending, and God stepped out, and guess what? Jacob makes a promise to God at this place, and he said, and we'll get to that later on, but he's talking about how, God, if you fulfill your promises and bring me back to my dad's land, I will call you my God. And he actually promised to give a tithe. Well, I thought pastors made that up just to make some money. Oh, no, wait a minute. He actually promised, he says, listen, I'm going to give you the first. I'm going to give you a tenth, okay? And he goes in and he lays it out here. If you bring me back, I promise that you're going to be my God. And so here he says, I want you to go to Bethel, and I want you to dwell there and make there an altar unto God that appeared unto thee when thou fleddest from the face of Esau thy brother. So when you're running away from Esau, who wants to kill you because he hates your guts because you stole his blessing, when you're running away, I stepped in and I showed up and I promised you that I was going to take care of you. This is the moment that I stepped in, and you went all the way to the homeland, came back with 2 wives, 2 concubines, and a bunch of kids, and a bunch of speckled and spotted flocks, right? And brings all these things back to the land, to your father's land. Listen, I want you to go back to Bethel. So this is the instruction. This is what God wants them to do, okay? So this is very important. Now, wait a minute. If God wants them to move, they still have an opportunity to get massacred by all the neighbors. So how are they going to get through that? There's a question. God, are you going to keep us safe? Well, if God asks us to do something and it's within his will, that's the safest place we could be in. Right in the middle of his will. You say, well, what if something happens to me? God's plan. God's plan. But you know what? I'm pretty sure there was 3 guys who stepped into a fiery furnace, following the will of God. And you know who was right there with him? Jesus Christ. A Christophany, that's a term that was used for when Jesus showed up in the Old Testament. God is there. God is present. If he wants us to do something, if he wants to stand up, and so that's where we come back to, is God enough? I'm going to ask that question again. Is God enough? So let's jump into verse number 2, but point number 2, Jacob obeys and he instructs. So here he is. He's going to do exactly what God said, but some things need to happen before they make their move. And they go into verse 2, and it says, Then Jacob said unto his household and to all that were with him, Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. That's interesting. I want you to take all the idols, all the graven images, and I want you to get rid of them. I want you to cast those out. And I want you to be cleansed. Now get that idea. Okay, here it is. 2 of his sons just went in and murdered a bunch of guys. And the rest of the sons jumped in and they ravaged the land, took everything that they wanted. And here it is, Jacob saying, listen, I want you to get rid of all of your idols, everything else that you have put in place of God. I want you to cast those out. I want you to be clean. I want you to even change your clothes, because guess what? We're going to be meeting God. He says, let us arise. Okay, verse 3, if my remote's going to work. You want to just go to verse 3, Bobby? All right, thank you. You're a blessing. And let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make there an altar unto God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went. So here we are. We're going to God. We're going to meet him, the one who was the answer to my problems. He's the answer. He is enough. He was there. And they gave unto Jacob all the strange gods which were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears. Isn't that interesting? We'll get to that just a second. And Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. Verse number 5. And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of God. How did they make it through? The answer is God. That's when your Sunday school answer works right there. The answer is God. Verse 6, So Jacob came to Luz, which is in the land of Canaan, that is Bethel, he and all the people that were with him. And he built there an altar and called the place El Bethel, because their God appeared unto him when he fled from the face of his brother. Now, when we're going back to all that's going on here, he's saying, listen, we're going to meet God, but first, we need to be sanctified. And you say, well, that's a big word. That's one we don't often use except for in church services, okay? But in sanctified and being set apart, there is a matter of a cleansing to where when I am going to meet his face, something has even got to change physically about me. There is a deep level of respect. There is a deep level of awe. When I am going to worship God, something needs to change out of the norm. You say, well, this is where we all get Sunday dress from, isn't it? Well, I think that's an interesting principle to get from it. I don't think that that's the main point of the context, okay? Because they didn't really have Sunday dress back when Jacob was around, but here he is. He's saying, listen, we're going to meet God, and so first, I want you to take all of your false idols, and I want you to take them, and I want you to give them to me. And they went, and they got them all up, they collected them all up, and then they even collected all of their earrings. I think that's interesting. Why their earrings? Why their earrings? Well, guess what? If they were golden earrings, guess what they could take in order to melt down into more idols? That's interesting. But why? Why did he go off and he buried them underneath an oak? Why did he do that? Has anybody ever asked that question? Did that just kind of pique your attention? Well, I've got a couple of verses here for you that might show you a little bit about Canaanite worship. And Isaiah 57:5, inflaming yourselves with idols under every green tree, slaying the children in the valleys under the cliffs of the rocks. Is there a relation here to idols underneath a green tree? But they sacrifice, okay? This is Hosea 4:13. They sacrifice upon the tops of the mountains and burn incense upon the hills under oaks and poplars and elms, because the shadow thereof is good. Therefore your daughters shall commit whoredom and your spouses shall commit adultery. What's going on there? They're talking about the worship around the oak tree, and there's other trees that they involved there. But going on, then shall ye know, this is Ezekiel 6:13, then shall ye know that I am the Lord, when their slain men shall be among their idols, round about their altars, upon every high hill, and all the tops of the mountains, and under every green tree, and under every thick oak, the place where they did offer sweet savor to their idols. Isn't that interesting? There's a relation somehow to the pagan worship where they would relate to an oak tree, or there was other different trees that they would relate to and where they would go and worship. And it's like Jacob is taking everything that could relate to their pagan worship and going and tossing it to where it started and where their place is. And I'm going to leave it all behind. I'm going to bury it. I'm going to hide it. Now, we can go into the question of, well, does that mean that he's saving it for later? There is that question. But knowing his purpose, I'm not sure. Maybe that's his motive right now. Obviously, God is the one that knows his heart, but it really doesn't get into detail about that right now. And so what's happening is he's collecting all of these things. He's going to bury it. Hopefully it stays there. Nobody goes after it. And guess what? Jacob's got to watch out, because it's his own wife that's brought the false idols from Laban. Do you remember that? They're headed back from the homeland, and guess what? Laban's coming after them. And God steps in and says, don't even say a word in the positive or the negative. And then he throws out the excuse, well, you stole my idols. Who had it? His daughter, Rachel. And so this goes pretty in depth as far as his family. It's not just the workers around the house. It's not just those that are watching over the flocks. It's within his favorite wife's heart that she's giving herself to these idols. But you'd often think that if Dinah's going into the land and hanging out with the ladies of the land, what are they worshiping as well? Maybe it's the gods of the land as well. So when they went into Shechem to take everything out, then most likely they would have taken all of the idols from the area. Do you know what Jacob realizes? If I'm going to go and I'm going to fulfill my vow to God, we got to start getting serious. We got to take it all, and we got to get rid of it. We got to put it to death. That's the idea that I'm getting here. Let's bury it in the ground. You say, where is this vow that you're talking about? Well, it's in Genesis chapter 28 and verse 20 through 22. It says, and Jacob vowed. Remember, this goes back to when God renewed that covenant with Jacob, and the ladder's going from the earth to heaven. It says, and Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. God, if you're going to take care of me and you bring me back, and you fulfill your promises, you're going to be my God. And this stone, which I have set for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that shall give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. This is where it all is. If you're not gaining the context, then you're missing a huge portion of what's going on in this story. Jacob is following through. He's fulfilling his promises. And all the craziness over the past few decades that he's been dealing with, all of the nonsense, all of the drama, all of the politics, all of the running for your life, and all of this. And yet God has kept them safe through this entire journey, and it's provided for him more than just the food and more than just his clothes. He's provided him flocks. And he's providing him the riches of that time period to where even in their jewelry. I mean, listen, if you're struggling to get food, I'm guessing you're probably taking your jewelry to the pawn shop, right? If you got jewelry hanging around, that means you got a little bit excess. And he's got all of this stuff. Why? Because of God. So that does bring some application here, folks. When you go to meet with God, do you ask for forgiveness for the sins that you've committed? I think it's only right that when we meet for the Lord's Supper, when we meet for communion, what is the first thing that we're supposed to be doing? We're supposed to be examining ourselves. Because if we actually want to lift up the sacrifice that Jesus has done for us, and in his body broken for us, and his blood shed for us, if we want to lift that up and worship Jesus for what he's done, then we need to first take care of the junk that we have in our lives. To let it go, to get rid of it, to cast it out. There's some sanctification that needs to be had. And when he did all of this, he goes and he sets up an altar ready for worship. Now that's where we come back and we say, well, everything is just going to be peachy from now on, right? Everything's just going to be perfect for Jacob. Does that happen? You know the story. You know what happens. And it doesn't stop with him. Joseph, did he have it all together as far as like every single circumstance? Did it just come perfectly for him? What about Israel? You know, as you go farther and farther down the line, was everything just perfect as far as their circumstances went? No way. And so what we find here is what is perfect is the God of our circumstances. And so what does happen next is what you find is tragedy and renewal. You say, well, what's the tragedy? Well, there's a ton of it that happens in this next portion of the chapter. There's a ton of tragedy, but yet in the midst of it, God steps in. So let's go through it. But Deborah, in verse number 8, but Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried beneath Bethel under an oak, and the name of it was called Allon Bakuth. Now, wait a minute. We're going all the way back to Rebekah. Is Rebekah around? His mom, is Jacob's mom around, or is she gone? She's gone. And so what he has left of his mom is Deborah, the one who can connect him with his mom is Deborah, the one who's been that helped Rebekah all the way through. And so guess what? Jacob, the one who did he connect with the most? It would have been his mom, but he's already lost her. And so here it comes down to the one that could connect him back to his mom is now gone. So he buries her. In verse number 9, all of a sudden, here we find the renewal. And God appeared unto Jacob again when he came out of Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said unto him, thy name is Jacob. Thy name shall not be called any more Jacob, but Israel shall be thy name. So he's really reassuring him of this name change that's supposed to be happening that was referenced a couple chapters ago. And he called his name Israel, finishing out number 10. Verse 11, and God said unto him, I am God Almighty. mighty, which he's proved himself already, and he will continue to prove himself over and over again. And he says, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall be of thee, and kings shall come out of thy loins. He's promising again, renewing the vow that he's made with Abraham and Isaac and now Jacob, and saying your kingdom is going to grow. There's going to be kings coming out of your lineage. In verse 12, and the land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed after thee will I give the land. And God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. It's beautiful. The renewal, God stepping in, and even in the midst of tragedy and of loss, God's still stepping in, saying, even though you've lost something that is here on this earth, that's in the horizontal relationships, the vertical relationship is still intact. The vertical is still happening. So verse 14, and Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, even a pillar of stone, and he poured a drink offering thereon, and he poured oil thereon, and Jacob called the name of the place where God spake with him Bethel. And they journeyed from Bethel. Say, well, wait a minute. I thought God called them to Bethel. You're right. He wanted them to go back to that place. Now, in this moment, is Jacob wrong in leaving Bethel? I don't really believe so. Okay? Now, you can go in and study it for yourself. I really don't believe so, because if you go back to the covenant that he made with God, he wanted to go back to his father's land. So what he's going to be doing is going back to his father in this point. So some would believe that he is wrong in this, and that's why the tragedy is going to continue to come. But I'm not along that viewpoint, because he's still in the land that God has promised him. He did go back and he did worship. He did exactly what God had told him to do, and now he's journeying forth. Okay, so as we come along in verse 16, it says, and there was but a little way to come to Ephrath, and Rachel travailed, and she had hard labor. Here she is. She's pregnant with the second child. She's had all of these pregnancy. She was barren for such a long time. Finally had Joseph, and she named him with the hopes of having another son. And finally it's coming to be, but she's having a harsh pregnancy. And verse 17, and it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said unto her, fear not, thou shalt have this son also. And it came to pass, her soul was in departing, for she died, that she called his name Benoni. Now, that's not what his name remained, because his father called him Benjamin. Now we'll get to the reason why that's going on there. But in verse 19, and Rachel died and was buried in the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. And Jacob set a pillar upon her grave, that is the pillar of Rachel's grave unto this day. And Israel journeyed and spread his tent beyond the tower of Edar. And it came to pass, when Israel dwelt in that land, that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard it. What happened? Now the sons of Jacob were 12. Wait, what happened? How did he respond? He just goes in to start naming off of his kids. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, and Levi, and Judah, and Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, and the sons of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid, Dan and Naphtali, and the sons of Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, Gad and Asher. These are the sons of Jacob, which were born to him in Padan Aram. And Jacob came unto his Isaac his father, unto Mamre, unto the city of Arba, which is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned. And the days of Isaac were 180 years. Boy, that's a good long life, isn't it? 180 years. And Isaac gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered unto his people, being old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Now some of you are struggling here. tragedy, tragedy, another tragedy with Reuben, but nothing came of it yet. And then another tragedy. All these things that are happening. So the connection that he had with his mom, gone. His favorite wife, gone. But God provided a partial fulfillment of the promise where here it is. We have Benjamin. She named him Benoni, but that was the son of her sorrow. As she is exiting this world, here it is. She's sorrowful, but yet Benjamin stepping in, the son, hey, this is my right-hand man. This is where Jacob's coming in and saying, this guy is going to be my right-hand man. This son is going to be right here, right next to me. I'm going to cherish him, which we know later on becomes an issue as far as favoritism goes. But then all of a sudden, as soon as Rachel dies, which is his favorite wife, then his firstborn commits adultery with one of his concubines, which was connected to Rachel. It's the one that Rachel had given to him. And so it's almost like a slap in the face, another tragedy that's here. He doesn't even deal with it. He doesn't say anything about it. And then he shows up to his dad, and his dad dies. What is God doing? Have you ever asked that question in your life? What is God doing? Because I can't see what's happening. And you know, the answer to that is it's okay that you can't see what's happening. It's okay. Because when God called him to go to Bethel, Jacob stood up and told his family, we've got to let go of the earthly ways. We got to get rid of this idol worship. It's time to be separate. He moves on. He worships God. Deborah dies. God steps in, renews his vow. Rachel dies. What's happening here? Reuben makes a sinful choice, his firstborn. And then Isaac. Jacob made a decision to separate from the earthly ways and the idol worship for his family, but yet it seems like God is starting to take away all those relationships that Jacob's holding on to. And as tough as it is, Jacob's got to come back to this question. When all of it's taken away, is God enough? Is God enough? Can you imagine being Elizabeth Elliot? Your husband goes to a place that doesn't necessarily bring you the American dream. To a people who killed him. What was he doing? He was on the mission for God. And yet, at that point, she had to come to a decision. Is God enough? Wasn't there another missionary, and I'm forgetting his name. Is it Judson? That he went to a place, or was it Hudson Taylor? He went through like 4 different wives, and I don't know how many children. Lost them all. And he stayed. I'm just thinking of all that. Is God enough? I think of it from from a fleshly standpoint, kids, and teenagers, when your parents decide that we're going to follow after God and there's going to be some rules in our house where you're just going to have to get rid of what our world highlights and loves because God doesn't like that. Are you going to sit there and whine and complain about what's taken away? Or are you going to answer the question, is God enough? Adults, when God says it's time for a cleansing, it's time for a schedule change, it's time for you to let go and let God move, is it our decision to sit back and to say, God, this isn't fair. I've worked this hard and I've done all these things to get to this point and you're asking for this. Are you kidding me? We're going to sit back and understand that God is enough. Now, this one's tough. I've watched a lot of older folk start to lose their friends, their neighbors, their loved ones. And you come to this conclusion, and I've been asked this a lot, why doesn't God just take me home? Well, that's when I try to respond with, hey, listen, I think you're here because God put you here to help me along and to help others along and to do his work. But you know what? We've got to come to that question, is God enough? What if everything was stripped away? I mean, put it into your application. What if everything was taken away? Are we going to rest on his promises? What he says is good. Have you been reading the B.J. Schultz's prayer letters for like the last year? How many pastors, people that he's trained, people that he's worked with, die at a young age with crazy stuff happening to them, leaving behind young wives with young children? It breaks your heart, doesn't it? But it comes back to this. If we were in that situation and we were put up against those kind of trials, would we sit back and say, is God enough? Or is this my breaking point where I say he's not enough and I walk away? And that's difficult. And how many of you prayed for Jephthah, right? And they went through these crazy highs. Did you read the last letter? What happened? A year we were praying for this boy to get his surgery. He gets to where he needs to get, gets the surgery that he needs to have, gets back to Haiti, and his doctors decide to switch up his meds. Boom, he dies. Now, I've been in contact with his dad. And it's quite humbling. Because his dad is checking in on me. Sends me a message, hey, how you doing today? How's things going? How's the ministry? And then I check myself and say, I better not complain about anything when I respond to him. I better only reflect on God's goodness and how he's showing up in my life and how he is enough. And man, that really checks my language, doesn't it? And when I respond back to him and try to encourage him, and he says, yes, yeah, God is good, and he's just showing up, and he's just moving, and he's changing, and he's just responding to all these good things. And man, this is a guy that just lost his son. And yet it comes back to that very application of, is God enough for us? What if things get stripped away in America? What if all of a sudden we're thrown into a China-like situation where we have to go underground? How many of you are willing to step up and to do things that you never thought you would ever do because your underground church needs it? Oh, I'm just not comfortable with that. We'll just make sure that we have a tiny tots classroom during our underground church. Please, there's no underground tiny tots classroom, okay? They're all just together. And they're just trying to get together and to live through what is going on, because they're trying to trust in that God is enough, and they're not worried about if they have enough goldfish for the kids. Right? Where would our church be if that happened? I remember our church up north and talking to an older individual in the church. He said the best growth happened right after a Christmas cantata. And you say, oh yeah, that's why we have Christmas cantatas, to grow the church. No. This is what happened. They all went home after the morning service in preparation from the Christmas cantata that night. And a family was headed home and went into an intersection, and somebody smacked into them and killed them. The whole family. That's tragedy, folks. And that night, they didn't close down services. Everybody stepped up and continued forth. You say, how dare you? Why not just stop everything? Because they still were presenting Christ that night. They were still being a light, and knew that, there was a couple of individuals that were very influential in that cantata that night, and they just stepped up and they played whatever they were doing. They sang whatever they needed to sing, and they got through that night, and they got through that funeral where there were 4 different caskets in a row, and they got through that, and they came together and they dealt with the tragedy, because guess what, folks? God is enough. And their church grew because all of a sudden they knew, hey, it's not about just hosting a Christmas cantata. It's about us coming together because God is enough, and because Jesus Christ did come to this earth, and he was born, and he did die on the cross, and he did rise again 3 days later, and he conquered sin and death, and he rose again and to ascension, and he gave a commandment, and he says, listen, you need to go out and you need to tell the entire world, go and preach the gospel and make disciples and teach them all that I have taught to you. This is worth it because God is enough. And so we really need to come back to it. Kids, adults, it doesn't matter what age you are. Whatever's going on in this world today, I agree with you. It's tough. Can we all agree on that? I mean, it's tough. It'll shake you up. It'll get you to do a double take. It might even put you down for a few days, a few weeks, a few months. But we got to come back to that realization that God is enough. And that's exactly what Jacob was doing here. And does he get it all together after this? No way. Jacob still struggles. Just like each and every one of us, right? But he had to come to that conclusion, yes, God is